Right now, 2 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, in water so deep that the only light comes from the bodies of living creatures, there are 4,000 cars sitting in total darkness. Porsches, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, and one 1982 Honda that nobody will ever come back for. They've been down there since 2022, and they will be down there long after everyone watching this is gone. But here's what makes this story unlike any shipwreck you've ever heard of. The most devastating losses didn't belong to the people who owned the most expensive cars. They belonged to the people who'd never touched their car at all, who'd never sat in it, never turned the key, never even seen it with their own eyes. And what they felt when that ship went down, what thousands of strangers on internet forums tried and failed to put into words, reveals something unsettling about the way we attach ourselves to things that don't exist yet. This is that story. In the autumn of 2021, a man in Austin, Texas named Jim completed the construction of a car that had not yet been born. He'd been parked at his kitchen table for what he would later admit was an absurd number of hours, spinning a 3-dimensional model of a Porsche Taycan Cross Turismo on his laptop, clicking a paint option called Mamba Green on and off, watching the way the metallic flake reacted to a virtual afternoon sun that would never actually exist outside that screen. Mamba Green was not a subtle choice, it was loud, unmistakable. The sort of color that identifies itself from across a parking structure before you've even locked your own car. Jim selected it anyway, and the instant he finalized that specification, the instant his dealer transmitted the order to Porsche's manufacturing hub in Leipzig, Germany, something occurred that no Porsche engineer had ever programmed, but that every Porsche salesperson understood in their bones. Jim started to own that car, not on paper, not in any financial sense, not in any manner a judge would acknowledge, but emotionally completely. In that specific, irrational way, human beings claim a future they've been allowed to shape. This is a story about that species of ownership, and about what unfolds when the thing it's tethered to gets destroyed in a fashion so improbable, so extravagantly dramatic that the grief it triggers has no legitimate category to inhabit. Because losing a car you've never driven, never occupied, never inhaled, the leather of that is not a tragedy. You understand that it's not a tragedy. And still, Jim was hardly the only one caught in this spiral. Across the United States, Brazil, and stretches of Central America, several thousand people were at various stages of the same consuming relationship with a configuration screen. A woman in the American South who'd placed her order for a Panamera GTS Sport Turismo back in March 2021 had already endured multiple production postponements, each one recalibrating her anticipation the way a thermostat adjusts. Except this one only moved in a single direction. A man in Westchester County, New York, had committed to a GT4 in a paint-to-sample color, a process that tacked extra weeks onto the production schedule and that he spoke about with the gravity of someone commissioning a piece of fine art. A woman who registered on an internet forum for the sole purpose of announcing, with the barely contained elation of someone who had clearly been storing this up, that her Cayenne GTS was a custom build celebrating her 50th birthday. In New Jersey, a first-time Porsche buyer had selected cherry metallic for a rear-wheel drive Taycan and was counting down the days until it reached the port of Davisville, Rhode Island, a place he'd never visited and would never need to visit because a transport truck would carry the car the final stretch. And in Los Angeles, a man named Matt Farah, who evaluated cars for a living and had been waiting since August 2021 for a 718 Spider in something called Frozen Berry Metallic, a gentle, unlikely pink that he intended to ship straight to a shop in Blauvelt, New York, for an engine transplant that would more than double its factory horsepower, was monitoring the vessel's position the way a nervous relative tracks an incoming flight on their phone. The vessel was the Felicity Ace. She'd been constructed in 2005 at the Shin Kurishima dockyard in Imabari, Japan, and she was classified as a pure car and truck carrier, a roll-on/roll-off ship, which meant that every vehicle she transported was driven aboard under its own power and slotted into position on one of her 13 enclosed decks, creating something that resembled, more than anything else, a floating multi-story garage with no exits to the outside world. The Felicity Ace measured 200 meters bow to stern, flew a Panamanian flag, and was operated by Mitsui OSK Lines out of Japan. On the 10th of February 2022, she departed the German port of Emden with 3,965 Volkswagen Group vehicles in her belly, all bound for the eastern coast of the United States. Those cars had been driven to Emden from factories in Zuffenhausen, Leipzig, Neckarsulm, and Sant'Agata Bolognese, then loaded by stevedores who guided each one to its designated deck position and fastened it to the floor using nylon lashing straps hooked to towing eyes. In the vernacular of maritime shipping, each vehicle was a unit. In the vernacular of the people awaiting them, each was something else entirely. 6 days after leaving Emden, on the 16th of February, approximately 320 kilometers southwest of Terceira Island in the Azores, something inside the cargo hold caught fire. Nobody witnessed the beginning. The 22-member crew became aware of smoke first, then of a blaze that was tearing through the sealed vehicle decks with a ferocity that the ship's onboard suppression systems simply could not contain. Within hours, the Portuguese Navy arrived overhead, lowering rescue baskets from helicopters, hoisting every single crew member to safety. No one perished. No one sustained serious injuries. The ship, now abandoned, now entirely consumed, began to drift. For an entire week, the Felicity Ace burned in the middle of the Atlantic. She burned in a manner visible on satellite photography, a pillar of white smoke climbing from a steel hull that had once been a stately navy blue and was now charring from the inside out. The Azorean harbour master told the press that lithium-ion batteries in the electric vehicles aboard had ignited and could be put out only with specialized equipment. Whether those batteries had actually sparked the original fire remained unclear, and as of the most recent investigations conducted years afterward, that question has never been conclusively answered. What was immediately and indisputably clear was that every car on every deck was experiencing temperatures that rendered the question of survival purely academic. It was during this week of burning that the forums transformed into something beyond forums. On Renlist, a website where Porsche enthusiasts dissect their vehicles with a level of detail that occasionally approaches the devotional, a thread appeared under the heading, "Thread for those who lost their car on the Felicity Ace ship fire." The word "lost" was performing unusual duty in that sentence. These cars were not lost the way keys are lost, temporarily displaced, and eventually recoverable. They were not lost the way a wager is lost, absorbed into a recognized framework of chance. They were lost in a manner that had no direct parallel in the experience of consumer goods, because the bond between these buyers and these machines had been deliberately engineered by Porsche's own configurator and production tracking infrastructure to become intimate long before it was ever physical. One man who'd ordered a Panamera wrote that he was very disappointed in Porsche because neither his dealer nor anyone from the company had reached out to him, not so much as an email, and he pointed out that this was not his first Porsche, that he owned multiple GT cars and several classics, as though the duration of the relationship entitled him to advance warning of its disruption. A woman contributed simply, "Just joining to commiserate with everyone. My birthday present was on Miss Felicity." She referred to the ship as Miss Felicity, the way you'd reference an unreliable friend who always lets you down at the worst moment. Another man reported that he'd lost his wife's Cayenne S Coupe and closed his message with his name Ikiru and the word cheers, as though wrapping a small wound in polite cloth. And then there was Jim, the man with the Mamba green takeout.
So, where are you
Over
headed?
on the Taycan
New York?
forum,
This
he'd
delay's
started
killing
his
me.
own thread
Tell me about
3
it.
days
Same here, at
before
least
the
the company's
fire.
good.
February
Right? Beat
13th,
sitting
a
alone.
thread
Flight
whose entire original purpose was pure, uncut anticipation. Let's endure this difficult waiting period together, he'd written. My car will get dropped off in Houston on or around March 2nd. Final destination is Austin, Texas. This is my first Porsche, and the wait has been painful. He'd posted a configurator image of the car, not a photograph.
I know it's tough for you too.
No photograph existed yet, just the digital rendering he'd poured all those hours into perfecting. The man
So
in
it's
New
really
Jersey
gone.
chimed in with his own excitement. The two of them
I knew it
spent
was
3
coming, but hearing
days
it's different.
tracking the ship's Atlantic crossing, forging a connection in that peculiar way strangers bond when they're waiting for the same thing, like passengers on a grounded flight who develop a brief, fragile closeness.
This is Jim's home. A
Then,
quiet
on
Austin
February
ranch house on a
16th,
late
a
afternoon.
user named
His car is
Temp1
there, the lawn
dropped a
is trimmed,
single
a child's
sentence
bike,
containing
neighbor's
2
sprinkler,
links
a mail
and
truck in the
0
distance.
emotional
Everything
cushioning.
is ordinary,
I think you might want to
intact.
call your dealer. The New Jersey man replied with one word: unreal. And Jim, the man in Austin, the man who had never laid eyes on, never sat inside, never caught the scent of the interior of a car he had, by his own telling, thought about every single day for months, wrote something that deserves to be taken seriously, even though its subject is, by any rational measure, trivial. I already feel a huge sense of loss for a vehicle that I've never seen. He continued. He described phoning his sales advisor, who had 6 vehicles on the ship, and whose income was therefore directly impacted. And then he wrote, I'm not sure I can go through waiting again. I might just pull the ripcord and forget about ordering another one if mine is lost. This was not a man in peril. This was not a man whose home had been consumed by fire or whose family faced danger. This was a man who had ordered a car and was now watching in real time the probability of its arrival collapse towards 0. And the emotion he articulated, the impulse to retreat from desire itself,
to the deep,
to never
the same
again
wreck site.
submit to this
But now,
specific
the
breed of
individuality
wanting,
is clear.
was genuine.
Each was a
It
unique
was
active
recognizable.
authorship, resting on
It
the
was,
Atlantic
in
floor.
its modest stakes way,
I've
a
reviewed
precise
the
miniature
specs, the
of something
figures
far
don't
larger,
align with what we
something connected to
discussed.
how human
I
beings
understand
manage
what
the annihilation of a future
adjust the
they had already
parameters.
started to
I'll
inhabit.
send
The
them a
psychology
blank
here
sheet.
is not trivial, even when the object is. Researchers who study material attachment have documented that the emotional bond between a person and a possession doesn't scale with time spent using it. It scales with the degree of self-expression invested in it. A mass-produced appliance generates minimal attachment. A customized object, one that reflects deliberate choices its owner made from a curated range of possibilities, one configured to serve as a public declaration of private taste, generates attachment that is structurally indistinguishable from what psychologists call an extension of self. The Porsche configurator, which invites buyers to select from hundreds of permutations of paint, leather, stitching, wheel design, and interior trim, is not simply a sales instrument. It is an attachment engine. It converts a transaction into an act of authorship. And what burned aboard the Felicity Ace was not 4,000 automobiles. It was 4,000 acts of authorship, each one belonging to a person who had already folded the result into their vision of who they were about to become. Matt Farrar, the automotive journalist out in Los Angeles, processed his loss differently than Jim. When Porsche offered to rebuild his Spider, he instructed them to construct it identically to his original specification. They gave me the opportunity to make changes to the build, he recounted later, and I said, build it like I ordered it the first time. There is something embedded in that insistence that goes deeper than mere convenience. He didn't want a revised edition. He wanted the version he'd already committed to, because the decision was inseparable from the object, and altering that decision would amount to conceding that the car was interchangeable, that any other configuration would fulfill the same role. The entire premise of configuring a car rests on the conviction that this specific arrangement of color, material, and mechanical specification is the one that corresponds to you, and to accept a substitution is to acknowledge that the correspondence was arbitrary all along. Farah waited 16 months for his replacement. He christened it Strawberry Shortcake. He had it immediately disassembled and reconstructed with a bored-out 4.5-litre engine producing 565 horsepower, roughly 150 more than the factory ever intended, and he drove it along the Pacific Coast Highway on a road trip with his wife that he later called one of the finest driving days of his life. The loss in his case was absorbed. The narrative picked back up. But the narrative did not pick back up for everyone. Somewhere in Brazil, 4 individuals had been awaiting the final Porsche 911 GT2 RSS ever produced on the outgoing platform cars that weren't merely custom but irreplaceable in the most absolute sense, because the assembly line had already been shut down when the Grande America, a different vessel, an earlier catastrophe, in March 2019, went under in the Bay of Biscay, carrying those 4 cars alongside 33 other Porsches and 2,000 additional vehicles. Porsche did something virtually unprecedented in automotive manufacturing. It reopened the GT2 RS production line exclusively to build 4 replacement cars, matched precisely to the original confirmed orders. This was not customer service. This was ontological reassurance. It was Porsche communicating to 4 people that their cars had not been erased from existence, that the specifications they'd committed to still possessed a physical future, that the act of choosing had not been squandered. 3 years after that, when the Felicity Ace sank with 15 Lamborghini Aventador LP780-4 Ultime models aboard the valedictory edition of a 12-year production run, each carrying an estimated sticker price above $500,000, Lamborghini followed the same extraordinary path. It restarted the Aventador assembly line. The final unit off that revived run was finished in a shade called Azzurro Flake and delivered to a buyer who by that point had been waiting close to a year beyond the original timeline. A year during which the car existed solely as a commitment inscribed on a production schedule that the Atlantic Ocean had temporarily interrupted. These corporate decisions to reanimate shuttered production lines are typically covered as heartwarming stories, proof that luxury manufacturers will move mountains for their wealthiest clientele. And they are exactly that, but they are also something more peculiar. They are tacit admissions that the identity of a particular car, its specification, its sequence number, its position within a production run matters in a way that transcends the physical object itself. And a Lamborghini Aventador Ultime is, in strictly material terms, aluminum and carbon fiber, and a 6.5-litre naturally aspirated and a particular sculpting of aerodynamic surfaces. But in the terms that govern its sale, it is also a number, the 47th of 350, or the last of the last. And that number constitutes part of what the buyer purchased. To manufacture a replacement stamped with a different number would be to deliver a different car, even if every physical component were a perfect match. The ocean had obliterated the matter. The manufacturer's obligation was to resurrect the meaning. This is the juncture where the Felicity Ace story splits away from every other cargo loss in maritime history, because this cargo was not faceless. A shipping container packed with machine parts that tumbles into the sea registers as a financial hit. A tanker full of crude that goes down registers as an ecological disaster. But 4,000 individually configured automobiles, each one a readable expression of a particular human being's taste, ambition, and self-concept, that is something for which no established classification of loss exists. It is not bereavement. It is not financial devastation. It is not even for the majority of the people involved a genuine hardship, since every manufacturer pledged to replace every vehicle and every buyer's deposit was secured. What it is precisely is the severing of an attachment that was intentionally cultivated by a system engineered to make the buyer feel the car was already theirs before it physically existed, and the reckoning in the aftermath with how absurd that feeling turns out to be. Think about the architecture of desire that produced this situation. A buyer opens the configurator. They spend hours, sometimes entire days, fine-tuning variables. The paint colors carry names Mamba Green, Frozen Berry Metallic, Gentian Blue, that are not descriptions but incantations, crafted to transmute a hexadecimal color value into an aspiration. Interior selections include not just leather and Alcantara, but contrasting stitching in precise thread colors, carbon fiber trim with a visible weave pattern angled to exact specification, and dashboard inserts available in brushed aluminum, dark silver, or high gloss black. Each selection contracts the universe of possible cars while expanding the buyer's sensation of creative ownership. By the time the order is finalized, the buyer has not simply picked out a product. They have authored a version of themselves that does not yet exist but will, they are certain, materialize the instant the car arrives. The car is not the destination, the car is the evidence. And then the ship burns and the evidence is gone, and what's left is the person, still contoured by the anticipation, but with nothing to anchor it to. Standing in a garage that is empty in a way it was not empty before the order was placed, because before the order it was just a garage without a Porsche in it. Now it is a garage where a Porsche was supposed to be. Those are profoundly different forms of emptiness. There exists a forum post from a woman who established a Renlist account on February 18th, 2022, 2 days after the fire broke out, solely to type, "My Cayenne GTS that I custom built for my 50th birthday is on that boat." She accumulated 3 total posts. She never came back to the forum. Whatever unfolded next in her relationship with that car, that birthday, that iteration of herself that had been briefly fused to a specific configuration of German engineering, she did not share it with strangers on the internet. The account remains there today, a small digital monument to a very particular variety of wanting. The Felicity Ace sank on the 1st of March 2022, 13 days after the fire first took hold. She went down roughly 350 kilometers off the Azores in water, approximately 3,000 meters deep, listing 45 degrees to starboard before capsizing abruptly in heavy seas. The Portuguese Navy documented oily residue and scattered wreckage on the surface. The 3,965 vehicles, the Taycans and Marcans and Cayennes and Panameras, the Bentegas and Continental GTs and Flying Spurs, the Huracans and Uruses and 15 Aventador Ultimas, the handful of Fendt tractors and MAN trucks, and tucked somewhere in the manifest among all that wealth, a 1977 Land Rover Santana, a 2007 BMW 750i, a 2015 Ford Mustang, a late model Kia Soul, a Nissan Versa Note, and the 65th Honda Prelude SIR ever manufactured, which had been crossing the ocean to a new owner who had never laid eyes on it. All of them descended into the blackness of the Atlantic basin, where the water pressure reaches 300 atmospheres, and the only illumination is bioluminescent, and where they will remain for a span of time that is, from the perspective of every person who ordered them, indistinguishable from forever. The insurance losses were estimated between $334 million and $401 million. Porsche replaced every single car. Lamborghini rebuilt every Aventador. Volkswagen honored every outstanding order. The production lines churned. The configurators stayed live. Within months, fresh ships were sailing out of Emden, bearing fresh cars for both new and returning buyers. And the people who had lost vehicles on the Felicity Ace were, in the vast majority of cases, driving replacements that were functionally identical to the ones they had originally specified. The material chapter of this story closed neatly. The factories manufactured, the dealers handed over keys, the money flowed where it needed to flow. But the Prelude was not replaced. The 65th Honda Prelude, SYR, a car that had been out of production for more than 2 decades, a car whose value resided not in its configuration but in its history, in the particular roads it had travelled and the particular hands that had held its steering wheel. That car was singular in a way that no volume of industrial output could reproduce. Its intended new owner, who had presumably located it after a lengthy search and coordinated its shipment from wherever it had been living to the port of Emden, who had almost certainly imagined the moment of its arrival with the same intensity that Jim had envisioned his Mamba green take, and that person received nothing, because there was nothing to receive. No production line could be reactivated, no specification could be resubmitted. The car was gone in a way the Porsches and Lamborghinis simply were not, because it had no future tense. It could only ever be past. And there, in the space between those two categories of loss, the replaceable and the irreplaceable, the configured and the discovered, the manufactured future and the inherited past, is where this entire story lives. Because what the Felistiace revealed, in its absurd and spectacular fashion, is that the modern luxury automobile is not truly an object at all. It is a promise dressed in a chassis. It is a relationship between a buyer and a possibility, and the physical car, when it finally shows up, is merely the receipt. Destroy the receipt and you can print another one. The promise endures. But some things are not promises. Some things are simply things built once in a particular era, carrying the evidence of their own passage through the world in their scratches and their patina and the specific way their engine sounds on a cold morning. The 65th Honda Prelude, SIR, was one of those things. It rests 3,000 meters down in the dark, beside 4,000 promises that have since been fulfilled again by somebody else, and nobody's coming back for it.